and thank you very much for attending our health seminar, which is organized by the Centre for Primary Health and Social Care at London Metropolitan University. So we really are fortunate today to have Professor Sanjoy Bhattacharya, Professor in the History of Medicine and Director of the Centre for Global Health Histories at the University of York, and also Director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for Global Health Histories, which I understand works across WHO headquarters in Geneva, WHO regional offices, and multiple WHO country offices. So the work undertaken by Professor Bhattacharya at this center, the Global Health Histories, includes research to assist policy initiatives and public engagement at WHO member state level. They have organized since around 2013 a regular program of seminars and workshops. These seminars have consistently created impactful partnerships globally involving WHO frameworks, other UN agencies, national and local governments, NGOs, civil society organizations, and universities. And the Wellcome Trust Award has also funded around 100 of these WHO Global Health History seminars, which have been delivered around the world. So Professor Bhattacharya has always worked in interdisciplinary ways and within intersectoral settings, and remains actively involved in health policy research and evaluation at national and with national and international agencies. There's far too many for me to name today, but having worked extensively in the Indian chapters of the global smallpox eradication program, including immunization programs, this seminar today on vaccine hesitancy asks who and what was sometimes resisted. So that's all I'll say, but please do join me in welcoming Professor Sanjoy Bhattacharya.
Okay, thank you, Yolanda, for very generous introduction. Shall I control the? I think I should. Are you controlling the?
You can move, Sanjoy. You can move the your slides through the arrows that you have just below the slide that you, as you can see it in your screen.
Very good.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Very good. So thank you all for joining us today. I mean, one thing the pandemic has done is it has made engagement over the net with people far and wide much easier. That is perhaps one positive. But I do miss engaging people face to face. I mean, I'll be talking a lot about the human factor and the human importance of human contact in international and global health programs, and therefore I shouldn't downplay the importance of my being able to engage with you face to face. So, but we are in the midst of a once in a lifetime pandemic, so I'm very pleased to be speaking to you today via this medium. So when Yolanda asked me to join all of you for this talk, and she asked me for a topic. I know Yolanda for many years. I was never going to say no. But on that particular day that she wrote to me, I'd been seeing and reading some very simplistic publicity stroke propaganda from several global health actors. And the context of this talk comes from that. I was very angry that evening, thinking about how small groups of closed clubs tend to simplify the notion of science and the implementation of science for very narrow political purposes, usually for their personal benefit or for the benefit of their organizations. And in so doing, they often ignore the welfare of the people they claim to care about and say and claim they want to look after. So it was that sense of frustration that evening that made me come up with this title. And I'm sticking to that original anger and frustration to try and provoke a discussion. Ideally, I don't want all of you to be angry at me, but I would like you to be angry about some of the issues that surround us. And I would like as many of us as possible to start questioning some of these simplistic assumptions, which are really more a fog of war than any actual description of care and humanity and morality. So I'm not pulling any punches here today. So let me start with the 19th century. And the 19th century remains relevant to today, the 21st century, simply because simplistic narratives of smallpox, the first vaccine for smallpox, and then how the invention of a vaccine then led to ultimately smallpox eradication. That history remains very powerful to this day for people and organizations that like to highlight the importance only of technology as a solution supposedly to everything, every problem we have. It's the silver bullet approach that is often quite damaging, especially in relation to the social and social and cultural determinants of health, where technology is a part, but not the only factor in improving health and well-being of people as they experience it day to day in disparate, very varied contexts. So let me start with one 19th century example. Middle of the 19th century, in 1857, uh, a set of papers was delivered to both houses of UK Parliament, which happened in 1857, which is a historically important year in empire. That was the year of the so-called Sepoy Rebellion in British India, or the First Indian Mutiny, depending on which historical interpretation you believe. Um, which claimed that vaccination had made smallpox less of a threat, especially amongst the better sections of society which had accepted vaccination, smallpox vaccination. These were referred to as the civilized classes of society, which I have in inverted commas. And apparently for them, smallpox was no longer a fatal disease, and this point was made to highlight the fact that there were still less civilized peoples, according to people who use such terminology, who were open to the threat of smallpox, which was still a massive threat. And because they were less civilized, they were not accepting smallpox, and therefore smallpox remained a threat. Now, what we must remember is that even though such views were expressed in the British Houses of Parliament, they had a variable impact in the UK. Some people did believe in what was being said in the Houses of Parliament, and some sections of society, some institutions supported an expansion of vaccination in the UK at that time, or after the declaration was made. But the point remains is that some people did not. There was organized resistance and opposition to smallpox vaccination throughout the 19th century in Britain. And some of this resistance did not deal with the scientific nature of the vaccine, but often dealt with who was delivering the vaccine. So the delivery system, the human factor in the delivery system, was often what was being resisted. And there are a lot of reports that subsequently came out in Britain that did indicate that. And you can also sense that in anti-vaccinationist sort of pamphlets and material. I give you one example here, where a police-like figure is indicated as the person who would vaccinate and is likened to death. So, because high prose and soaring, rhetoric in the Houses of Parliament could not impact what was happening on the ground in Britain or its wider empire. Hesitancy and resistance continued in the UK and in the empire too. But there were differences, and those differences arose from context. And this is something that people, even today, when they talk about the science, our wonderful Secretary of State for Health keeps talking about the science, talks about the science as if it just exists, hanging in the environment out there without any context. But what I'm trying to argue to all of you today is that science is imagined, science is produced, science is financed, science is run, science is implemented, all within context. And as political, social, and economic context changes, all those aspects of science also change. And therefore, it is impossible, really, for anyone who's even slightly critical or slightly thoughtful to talk about a unitary science. There were multiple sciences, and that's something I'm going to describe to you today. So this poster that I use for this part of the talk is again sort of anti-vaccination, anti-vaccine hesitancy related material, and it's about the use of animal pox, cowpox for smallpox vaccination, and it's showing that people who are vaccinated are sprouting bits of animals from their bodies because animal material has entered their bodies. So what material like this or vaccine hesitancy is doing is that it is often questioning the underpinning assumptions that are being made in that particular context by certain politicians who are trying to speak about the science in very simplistic ways. There is an attempt at different levels of society to engage simplistic political narratives about the science of vaccination in a multiplicity of ways. When one studies this material through unpublished material, so what am I trying to say? So when you study anti-vaccinationist material through unpublished archives, not through official proclamations and responses that come out in newspapers, because those are always, oh, we are 100% confident that our science is reliable. When you go into the unpublished archives, like a good historian, and start looking at unpublished papers between scientists and implementers of science and government officials, you begin to see a more complex picture. What becomes clear is that there is no the science, but there are multiple strands of science this official recognition of the coexistence of multiple strands of science, there is a disagreement about which bits of the science are better. There is disagreement about how what is agreed by politicians to be the best solution should be communicated. And then there is fear when that messaging, which they have agreed to communicate, goes out of control. There is fear about what can be done. So, to give you an example, animal pox was often seen and talked about in scientific circles of the 19th century. As I said, context is very important, as a poison. Because it was talked about as a poison, there was fear that while the cowpox poison might protect them from smallpox, there was fear that that poison might actually transmit other animal diseases, other diseases that animals suffered from, to human bodies. And that is what I think this particularly anti-vaccination poster is trying to represent. Now, talking about context, we have to ask ourselves, so what was the smallpox, quote unquote, science in the late 18th and much of the 19th centuries? This is the era of the spread of Jennerian vaccination all over the world. Some have called it the globalization of the Jennerian vaccination. This was an era when there was talk of miasmas. What is a miasma? It was an environmental pollutant, if you will, which you couldn't often see, but you could smell rotting vegetation. Sometimes, sort of smelly fog that you would see in swamps. They were considered miasmas. Smallpox, many people thought, was spread through such environmental pollutants, through miasmas. Not just smallpox, other diseases too. Therefore, you have a situation where people like Florence Nightingale and others are talking about the importance of ventilation, keeping windows open, allowing drafts to sort of, cleanse the environment, internal environment, to sort of dilute pollutants. That is the language. And I see some popular writing about this coming up, and it's quite a historical when people talk about these ideas and say, you know what, when we say that open windows to prevent COVID, this was being thought of before. Actually, it wasn't, because there was no germ theory of disease. The idea of opening windows might be similar, but why the windows were being opened were actually quite different. But of course, that is simplistic popular science, usually clinicians with a acute lack of understanding of history or historicity coming up with a lot of these supposedly historical pieces that now, sorry for the use of the word, infect the social media, completely historical stuff. But, therefore, ventilation was considered very important. But beyond Britain's elite and beyond Britain itself, this often led to civilizational theories of disease transmission. The rich, the powerful, people who lived in houses which actually had a window that could be opened felt very superior because they had access to the science and were doing all these things and were apparently feeling safer. But at home and in empire, there were the poor. People often didn't have houses, leave alone windows in houses. But assumptions were being made about them, damaging class and race-based assumptions about how they were dirty, how they wore dirty clothes, how they did not clean themselves, how their houses were filthy, and therefore smallpox was rampant. So you have to understand that this was the science of the late 18th and 19th centuries that was being questioned by those hesitant, who were being labeled as hesitant or resistors of vaccination. So what was the scientific sort of notion of early, what was the science behind early vaccination? Of course, it's linked to the cowpox. Yeah. I mean, that bit of heroic history cannot be challenged. I mean, Jenner's ideas emanated from the fact that he had seen people who worked with cows getting a pox from the cows, which you call cowpox, usually on the hands. And these people seemed never to catch smallpox whenever there was a smallpox outbreak. So through that observation, he then said, why not try transfer some of the pustular material from that cowpox, not necessarily just from the cows, but also from the humans who had caught it from the cows, and then give it to another human being, and then see if that person gets smallpox or not. And through that process of observation, Jenner was able to show that cowpox, either from the cow or secondhand from a human being, could somehow protect other human beings from what was a much more dangerous disease. Now, it's often discussed that the sort of ethical standards that Jenner used, the moral standards Jenner used, would not have stood up to scrutiny in this day and age. But it was a set of practices that he wrote down, delivered to peers, and then his peers accepted his findings, and then some very powerful scientific institutions in Great Britain published it, giving these findings a certification that then led to governmental support for early vaccination. But what I want to point out to all of you is that Jenner's findings were an ideal. He was talking about a very ideal situation where he'd been able to carry out his observations carefully in relatively peaceful, well-resourced contexts. But such an ideal was not particularly easy to implement in less peaceful and less well-resourced parts of Great Britain, leave alone empire, where the challenges, the infrastructural challenges, the social challenges, the cultural challenges, the climatic challenges were much, much bigger. What I'd also like to point out is that in the late 19th century, as many germ theories come into play and become influential, it did not mean that they automatically displaced older miasmatic ideas of disease transmission. So even in the late 19th century, you often see a combination of causes being at play when explaining the cause and the spread of smallpox, both in Britain and its empire. So then, were variolation and vaccination completely different things? What was variolation? Variolation was basically the use of the smallpox quote-unquote poison taken from the smallpox pustule or the scab that covered the pustule, usually after someone was recovering from the disease. It was usually collected from people who had survived the disease rather than dead bodies, because people who had died from the disease were seen to be carriers of an extreme poison. So those who were recovering from smallpox were very valued sources of pustular or material or smallpox scabs, which were then weakened by being stored for some years or by being diluted, by being crushed and then being diluted with things like oil, honey, etc., in the hope that when this material was given to another human being, he or she would get a mild case of smallpox. And once it was observed that once someone had a mild case of smallpox, they would not then ever catch smallpox again. So that was the whole idea of variolation. And the smallpox variolation practice, of course, varied from country to country. There were multiple methods in China, multiple methods in India, what is now India, what is now China, in the Ottoman Empire, and there's that famous story of the British ambassador's wife, Lady Morley Montagu, transferring it from the Ottoman Empire to Great Britain, and it's spreading in Great Britain. Vaccination, on the other hand, as I've just described, was about transferring cowpox pus, but it was also seen as a poison. And in empire, where cowpox was not easily found, pus was taken from other animals, but after they'd been given smallpox through human smallpox material, they'd been sort of inoculated with human smallpox material that then gave them a sort of pox disease, which was then sort of literally excavated from their pustules and then used in humans as vaccine. So what I'm trying to point out here is that early vaccination was not a universal technology. There were great variations. It was not very well communicated. It was not very well understood, especially when it left the confines of Britain. And therefore, when it spread to British Empire, especially British India, which is the context I've studied in greatest detail, there was confusion about why someone should give up on variolation, which was relatively reliable, and why people should move to animal pox-based vaccination, which seemed relatively unreliable, at least in the early parts of the 19th century. And so the resistance at that time came not from an idealistic treatise that Jenner had produced about his successful experiments, but from the nitty-gritty, ground-level, messy, lived experience of early vaccination. So what was being resisted was the confusion in the communication of science of early vaccination. So this then raises the question where did this 19th century vaccination hesitancy and resistance lie? Was it only about religion and superstition? Here is the South Asian goddess of smallpox, Shitala Devi, who is actually in South Asia. There are Shitala temples, and people of all religions, when they were afflicted by smallpox, which was a much feared disease, would go to that temple and give offerings in the hope that they would be cured from the infection. So, I mean, a lot of British officials in the 19th century like to talk about British India sort of indigenes or natives, as they used to call them, being religious and superstitious, and therefore attributed hesitancy and resistance to that superstition, that religiosity. So was it about religion and superstition? Was it about Shitala? Was vaccination unpopular because it was secular? Not always, because what is absolutely clear is that many variolators who were also religious figures or had a religious role in society would often move to vaccination. So when you go into the archives and look at what is being resisted, there are a variety of other factors that actually sound quite sensible from a cultural perspective. In many Indian contexts, especially Hindu contexts, the use of cows was opposed. So cow pox was just not acceptable. This is why often buffaloes, goats, and donkeys were used in British India. But then again, vaccination in this form, straight from an animal to a human arm, was seen to be unreliable, which then created resistance because it was a painful operation. If an operation was carried out and the vaccination did not take, because you would have 2 or 3 pustules on your arm if the vaccination took, if those didn't appear, it meant that the vaccine hadn't worked. And when the vaccinators came back and said, "Oh, you didn't take, can we vaccinate you again?" They would say, "No, we're not going through another painful operation where you're going to cut into my arms and push vaccinal material in." When my students ask me, "So what was it like?" So the best example I can give them is that at its mildest, the description sounds like stuffing a Christmas turkey. You have vaccinal material mixed with lymph or lanolin, so sort of plasticine material, which you're cutting incisions into a human arm and then stuffing that cutting with this vaccinal material. So you have to understand the 19th century technology, the pain that it caused, to also understand hesitancy and resistance. British Indian officials often also encountered opposition due to vegetarianism. There are a lot of vegetarians, so it didn't matter what animals you used, people resisted vaccination because it came from an animal product. But there's also a historiographical problem. Historians are often guilty because they often try to understand the past in present day terms, which I think is a big problem. The past has to be studied in its own terms. And when you study the past in present day terms, you become humanly incapable of understanding what 19th century technology is. You imagine that a present day vaccine is being used 200 years ago, and therefore you can't really understand resistance and hesitancy and complexity, and you tend to make simplistic generalizations about cultural determinants and superstition and religion. I'm not saying religion and superstition weren't there, they were there. But there were other factors at play as well, which often historians who are presentist often do not recognize and therefore do not study. As I said at the beginning, these are the type of scholars, and here the clinicians who turn historians are particularly guilty. They cannot understand context. They cannot understand the diversity of context. They cannot understand that public health is necessarily a mosaic. It isn't about 5 scientific heroes going into a monolithic society to do vaccination. It's about 5 individuals who privately hold very different views, publicly agree on a view, going into a societal structure that has extreme diversity, and are then trying to impose that unitary view on huge numbers of people. Some people accept, some people resist. If that basic reality is not understood, and it can be understood by studying history, then present day vaccinators or public health workers will always keep making the same mistakes in not being ready for a variety of responses that they have to adapt to to ensure that their vaccination strategies are successful. I'll deal with that at the very end. So very quickly, rushing through the first half of the 20th century, such variations continued in the 20th century. So, this is a hand with an animal pox. So, this is a hand displaying an animal pox. So there was a phase when humans, usually poor children and orphans, would be used to transmit vaccine human to human. In fact, sometimes a set of orphans would be vaccinated in London. The ship would then leave for Bombay, and there would be a huge team of orphans. They would be given vaccines one by one to keep the vaccine going. And then it was hoped that when the ship landed in Bombay, then there would at least be one child with a pustule like this, which would then be used to quickly transmit to other human beings in Bombay, or other humans or other animals, other humans and animals in Bombay, so that the vaccine would be continued. So again, as I keep saying, very important to understand the technology in context. What was often resisted in such vaccine transfer mechanisms was the sheer inhumanity of using poor people and orphans as vessels of vaccine. So it wasn't the science of vaccine, it wasn't the vaccine itself that was being resisted, but it was the inhumanity of the practice that was often resisted. Now, what happened in the second half of the 20th century? The Second World War happens, the Allies win, Axis powers lose, there's a new sort of international relations, there's a new post-war sort of consensus, there is hope, there's fear of atomic weapons. From that fear comes new ideas of peace, hope. There are new modernities, technologies produced during the Second World War, which some historians like Mark Harrison argued helped the Allies win the war, like DDT against malaria, become the new silver bullets, a malaria eradication program starts. But there are also advances with the smallpox vaccine, because armies had to be vaccinated. Smallpox and malaria were major threats to the war effort. So better vaccines developed after the war, but there are still technical problems. They're wet vaccines. They need refrigeration. Refrigeration needs electricity. And in many imperial locations and newly independent countries, electricity was a rare commodity that was present in the big cities and not really available in the villages. So, rural vaccination is still a challenge. The other invention that becomes very important is the vaccination gun, which I've pictured here before, which allows you to vaccinate a lot of people very, very quickly, and it is seen as something that is necessary for the post-war vaccination campaign. Dry vaccines become more common in the 60s, predominant in the 1970s. Why is this important? They don't need refrigeration. They're easier to use. They have fewer side effects. And as a result, throughout this period, you see different responses and different forms of hesitancy and resistance to vaccination. Now, a reliable vaccine without side effects was important, as was communicating information about a vaccine. But what I'd like to point out to all of you is that attendant technologies were crucial too. Scarifiers and rotary lancets, which created big wounds in people's arms, often called instruments of torture, were replaced by the simple bifurcated needle, which was basically a sewing needle with a flattened head, which created less deep wounds, created less invasive vaccination operations, fewer post-operative infections, and therefore made resistance and fear of pain and side effects less prevalent around the world. It was also more efficient in other ways, in that you could use a vial of vaccine to vaccinate more people. So at a time of vaccine shortages, the bifurcated needle was also very important. I accept the importance of technologies like the bifurcated needle. But often what historians, and when I say historians, I use that as a very broad definition. I include people who write biographies, people who write in very heroic ways, who either privilege their own contributions or privilege the contributions of their closest buddies, and don't talk about local actors very much because they hardly spoke to these natives. But historians like that often forget that the hands that hold the bifurcated needle are very important. And if they'd only done that, they would have, I think, been able to remember that just their hands were insufficient to vaccinate all the human beings that needed to be vaccinated for smallpox to be eradicated, meaning they couldn't have done it alone. There were a few thousand, they were supported, and they had cooperation of hundreds of thousands of people who they often forget to remember. And it was those people who knew about local cultural mores, local political problems, who would often give them important cultural and social information that would allow them to counter hesitancy and resistance. So combating hesitancy and resistance was not just about better technology, it was also about understanding the communities in which work was being carried out. And that is one of the biggest lessons for the smallpox eradication campaign. So delivery mechanisms were always crucial. This is a picture that I use on the cover of one of my books. And this from the 1930s in the United Provinces in British India. And I love this picture because it's a picture of a village vaccinator in the British province of United Provinces in British India in the 1930s. He's got a kit. If you look to the bottom right of the picture, he's got a kit, a vaccination kit. That kit includes sterilizing materials to avoid post-vaccinal complications. There is a little stove, a paraffin stove, in which there's a container in which he is constantly boiling vaccination lancets that he's reusing. And that became part of the effort to try and reduce post-vaccinal infections and complications so that there would be less resistance. He's attended by this chap in a black hat in a khaki suit who's a peon or a guard. He's unarmed. The biggest arm they carried was usually a bamboo stick. And one of their roles was to protect them, because sometimes the vaccinators would get beaten up by villagers, especially if they'd come back a second time after doing a bad vaccination first time, which it hadn't taken. So the guard was supposed to protect them. That was theoretical, because I've read lots of reports where both the vaccinator and the guards ran out of the village fearing for their lives as people pelted them with stones. But theoretically, the guard was there to protect the vaccinator. But if you read unpublished materials, what that guard is supposed to also do is to keep an eye on the vaccinator to make sure that this vaccinator would store the vaccine carefully and also apply the vaccination protocols properly. So, how you vaccinate is important. This is from the 1970s, the Indian Smallpox Eradication Program. The local communicator come vaccinator is still very, very important. Of course, there's the improved vaccine stability and there's a more reliable immune response to vaccination. But that vaccine technology had to be explained before people would accept it. Sometimes negotiations were required. Sometimes illegal immigrants in India who had come in from Bangladesh for seasonal work would not come for regular vaccination campaigns because they were scared they would be arrested and thrown out of the country. But some of these local workers knew where these illegal immigrants were and promised to vaccinate them privately, hidden away from sort of more official vaccination drives. It took this level of trust, this level of knowledge to make vaccination possible. And while they communicated, they also learned. What did they learn? These vaccinators who vaccinated would also go around with pictures of smallpox, asking people if they'd seen cases of smallpox. So there would be effective surveillance. They would be tracked down, then everyone who had been in contact with that smallpox case would be vaccinated. Basically, everything that's not happening with COVID-19 in Great Britain would be done to make smallpox eradication successful. It was a human resources heavy, human factor heavy, successful campaign. It wasn't just about technology. The resistance often was directed at teams, less so at vaccines. It was people and teams that were feared, not the vaccines. Sometimes there were doubts about vaccines too, but often a lot of the resistance that was reported was about, people who had previously done not very good things to those particular villages in relation to other health campaigns or other family planning campaigns going in with smallpox vaccines, and they would be feared and opposed. Very quickly, my last case study, polio elimination and eradication. Different disease, different vaccine. There are two types of vaccine that were available when polio elimination and eradication were being planned. One was injectable, one was oral. In high-income countries, elimination campaigns were largely delivered through strong health systems, mainly through injectable vaccine. When the globalization of polio vaccine happens, it happens through oral vaccines. And here the consideration, if you read the unpublished files, was a pain. People wanted to avoid pain because they'd learned that some people were terrified of the pain of smallpox vaccinations. They were trying to learn from that. And so they wanted a technology that could be given orally so it was easier to administer and easier to negotiate. Was this the silver bullet that allowed for quick polio elimination and eradication? I suggest not, because there were actual cases of bad storage of vaccine leading to the lack of efficacy. It needed cold chain, which would often not be effectively stored, which led to loss of efficacy. Teams would go into villages, give oral vaccine to children some of whom would then not be immunized and would catch the disease, get polio, and then doubts would start being articulated about the value of polio vaccination. In some cases, there were side effects and death, and news would spread uncontrollably despite efforts to control media outputs by international organizations and national organizations. You cannot control rumors, or they're very difficult to control. And sometimes these rumors would actually exaggerate the level of the problem, which would also stoke hesitancy and resistance. But there were other drivers of hesitancy too, and there's some excellent work about this, which for some reason current global health actors don't seem to want to read and learn from. There's very, very rich anthropological work which talks about the anger from the lack of development of care over decades, and then suddenly, they've never seen an official doctor to help them with any of the illnesses the children have suffered, and lo and behold, suddenly a polio vaccinator appears from nowhere saying, I'm here to give you vaccination to save your life. And the question then is, but you've never cared about my life before. Suddenly, why do you have to turn up here? Is this because you're getting paid extremely good daily wages as part of an international program? So the resistance was not to the idea that vaccination was helpful, but often due to the sheer frustration from the fact that their lives, the value of their lives, had been ignored for years, that their children were often suffering other diseases which they were not being treated for. And suddenly they had to accept this polio vaccine when many mothers and fathers were aware that many more children were dying either of pneumonia or diarrhea. So, again, these deeper questions about what was being resisted. And when I went and did some research on the polio eradication campaign in North India, what was often spoken about was the uncaring hand, the uncaring official, or the uncaring hand of the official. And that is what was being opposed, not vaccination itself. So, in that context, what existed and what made hesitancy and resistance a reality on the ground were communication weaknesses, which are often unassessed by external actors who want to only write stories of their greatness and successes and never of their failures. These are not open minded people who want to learn from mistakes and make a difference, because really they care more about their CVs than the people they claim to want to save from disease. So, to end, last slide. What is it that was then resisted? What is being resisted in all these campaigns that I spoke about? The vaccine? Sometimes. The mechanisms? Many times. The communications? Often. The claims that the vaccine was safe depended who said it. Because if it was someone from a locality who could explain in a specific language or dialect what the vaccine was about, what the aim was about, how it would help, then yes, it would be believed. But it was an outsider who couldn't even speak the language, needed an interpreter who was not from the locality, had no idea about what the local needs were, and basically barked a set of orders and then forcibly vaccinated people. Often there would be very violent resistance. The lack of humanity, speaking to people who've been on the receiving end of disease elimination, eradication programs, yes. We see that today in COVID. There's often a complete lack of humanity, a complete lack of understanding of the human factor of suffering, which often, not often, always leads to anger that then weakens vaccination campaigns. The refusal to acknowledge challenges on the ground. Well, privately, if you go into the archives, the challenges are actually acknowledged. What is not acknowledged is what does not exist is a public acknowledgement of the challenges and then the adaptations on the ground that were needed to make a vaccination campaign successful. The morality of an idealized project evaluation being used to shape future plans and projects, yeah, that's always a big factor of resistance, because when these evaluations come out, they're written by relatively small group of high-income country people who often forget the contributions, the very large sacrifices and contributions made by low and middle-income country contributors. And when these evaluations come out, the erasure of names, the erasure of contributions, the erasure of the strengths that low and middle-income country contributors bring to programs creates deep anger that then leads to administrative hesitancy and resistance to future vaccination campaigns. So what I've tried to say to you here today is human resources matter. The human factor needs care, careful planning, careful planning, careful delivery. If you look after, if we, our governments, the authorities that are in charge of any vaccination campaign, look after the human factor, both of those who are delivering the vaccines and those who are receiving vaccines, there is a greater chance of reducing hesitancy. What this generates is trust. Trust is the mightiest weapon against resistance. If you have trust, you don't need what I'm presenting here through this picture. A polio vaccination team working with armed guards in Pakistan, because a lot of polio workers, especially female polio workers, have been shot and killed by extremists. Why is that happening? because, again, a troubled history of politicization of vaccination campaigns, the false CIA planned hepatitis vaccination campaign, which was run in order to try and identify where Osama bin Laden was hiding. That story came out, and that story then stoked suspicion in all vaccination campaigns. And to this day, that is damaging, as Pakistan and Afghanistan continue to be two countries in which wild polio virus continues to circulate. So, Yolanda, I should end here. I think I've spoken. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sanjoy. It's such an interesting presentation, an interesting journey of so many examples, historical examples, contemporary examples as well of vaccine hesitancy and resistance. I shall like to open to our audience. I mean, if you have questions, you can either raise your hand or use the chat box. I think we have.
Yolanda, how do you stop sharing?
There.
Yeah, perfect.
Stop sharing. Okay. Yeah. So, Garrick McNeil, please.
And then hello, thank you. That was a really fantastic talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Really interesting. I'm going to ask you perhaps a slightly unfair question. I'd like you to go ahead 100 years from now and try and look back as a history of medicine and try and get a picture on all these genetic vaccines that we're currently using for COVID and what you might think we're going to be talking about in 100 years' time.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's usually suspicious of historians who try to predict the future, I'll try my best. So, I think 100 years later, I hope there'll be some historians connected to my family who look back and maybe find the notes I used today and ask if the science that underpins these amazing new mRNA vaccines was communicated properly. I suppose they look at my notes and also wonder why the cold chain was so complicated for some of these mRNA vaccines. And as historians, they might try to understand the factors that led to complications in the use of such mRNA vaccines in low and middle income countries, or even some high income countries where getting such, cold temperatures is very, very difficult. We're using these mRNA vaccines. It's very exciting to see this new technology come up in a pandemic. I'm not anti-science. I'm pro-science. I really hope this technology turns out to be not just useful for COVID, but for many diseases. Maybe a new generation of flu vaccines, which can, in due course, strengthen primary healthcare structures all over the world once they get the cold chain issue sorted. And maybe that will become the newest kind of vaccine, where I think the older kind of vaccine, the AstraZeneca type vaccine, the Oxford AstraZeneca type vaccine, will be remembered as well, because I think there will be some diseases where older technologies will continue to be relevant. Does that answer your question? I think I'm rambling now.
No, that's great. Yeah, no, I prefaced it by being a little bit unfair, trying to get a historian to go into the future and predict backwards. But no, thank you. It was a great talk. Really enjoyed it. Yeah,
thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Telly?
Yes, just compliment you for the presentation, Sanjay, particularly by contextualizing it in terms of post-colonial and now post-colonial context, in terms of if you consider who are the people that have been reported to be resistant to vaccination here as well as in America, this tended to be, people from the Black community, and that also I wanted to tie in to neoliberal economy and how that, given what was reported, Johnson stated to a group of MPs, which was about capitalism and greed, and the whole process of how the test and trace was dished out in a very fraudulent and corrupt practices. If that was was happening in Africa or in India, they would say, well, what do you expect of this corrupt a government? We give them the money and look at the way they've, dishing it out amongst their friends and families. And yet, this is where we are in 2021 in Britain, that purports falsely to be a society of probity and trust. And yes, so I'm delighted that you're invited to give this presentation. Yes, so for me, this is where it's at, and this is where communities and the public health, local public health, were totally sidelined, and where there's clearly a disaster of the number of deaths. Again, who are the frontline workers, people that were the victims of the virus. It's the same people throughout history, colonial and post-colonial history. Yeah, so I'd like to just say, well done.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I have been very, very worried about some of the generalizations that have been made about UK BAME resistance to vaccination. It's almost blaming the victims.
Yes.
But that is what people in power often do, and that is very sad and needs to be called out. And I'm very glad you've called that out. There is a problem in all sections, in all racial parts of British society. There is hesitancy in all classes and all races. Rather than demonizing a group of ethnic minorities as being responsible for the spread of COVID, like what happened in Luton or what happened in Leicester, what should be done is for at least a unity government in this crisis, where there is acceptance that there's hesitancy everywhere, that we need to understand these communities where there is hesitancy. In context, this is why what I kept saying today, in context. And in that context, you will have both white resistance and brown resistance and black resistance. And then understanding that context and then fighting that resistance and making the lives of people livable through a pandemic. I mean, in the smallpox eradication program, when there was effective surveillance and then isolation, the government provided packages, or the WHO, working with governments, provided packages for people to sustainably isolate themselves. This government has not provided sustainable financial support for isolation. And then they say that people are not isolating, so COVID is spreading.
Yes,
Or
yeah, yes, and also if you look at the time of Muslims who have been blamed for wanting to celebrate Eid and so on, but yet Christmas, look what happened as a result of the decision they made over Christmas, and that
yes,
created worse consequences of death.
yes, and we had the US Thanksgiving figures already as a warning.
Yeah, yeah.
And we chose to disregard it. So, you can call your science evidence-led, but that was a classic example where evidence from the US, which was giving us warnings, was disregarded for political purposes. So,
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's always easier for people in power to deflect blame, and this is a classic case of deflecting blame.
Mm.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sanjoy, I have one comment, I mean, and tag along of Telly's contribution and your responses as well. I was interested in your mentioning of part of the resistance to vaccination being the uncaring hand. Public Health England has recently, well, in all the COVID reports, made a slight, I would say, move in recognizing something quite strongly from Public Health England to come out with this notion of historical racism as explaining why COVID has affected more BMA populations. But of course, it seems to be there's always that divorce, yes, on that acknowledgement from what that point of view,
Yes.
or what you call the uncaring hand,
Yes.
and not acknowledging at the same time. From Public Health England itself, I have the feeling so far, not the feeling. I mean, we haven't read enough yet. We know that they are working in trying to engage community. We don't know exactly yet how they are managing that. But what we see more often is this, the resistance, the conspiracy theories, and I've been working with groups, including from Public England in London. I mean, workers, public health officials and so on. And the idea or the concentration is in those videos that circulate, the conspiracy theories and so it is a way, I will say, of again not recognizing this uncaring hand, isn't it? I mean, it's like on one side we acknowledge historical racism, but on the other we don't link the effort that might mean of these communities somehow, communities being offering some resistance perhaps, but not connected necessarily with distrusting the vaccination itself, but distrusting the system, on that uncaring hand that is not something that you overturn, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And, about a month ago, I spoke to a group of students from St. Andrews University. They were from the Amnesty International Student Society. And one of the issues they asked me about was, is it colonialism? And I think Zareen in the question box asked me the question that, is it historical colonialism that then results in resistance in the UK? And I think it's more complex, because I think what a lot of European public health actors, not just British public health actors, forget is that the first wave of immigration into this country after the Second World War of Asians, South Asians, were of people who had been deeply loyalist to the British Raj in South Asia, who then found it very difficult actually to continue working and living in newly independent India and Pakistan, because they were treated as people who were not patriotic, who had somehow been close to the British. So these people came with hopes. I mean, you see the same with the Harkis in Algeria, who then, large numbers moved to France after Algerian independence. And then what happens is they come to Britain in the hope that their contributions, their loyalism to Britain will be recognized. And it is not recognized. And they suddenly find themselves in ghettos outside Paris or in ghettos in London and completely forgotten and not being given the recognition. I mean, the Commonwealth sacrifices to the First World War and Second World War are now acknowledged on TV are a very recent phenomena. I mean, people didn't even remember how many black and brown people died in the great wars on behalf of the British Empire till very recently. And so it's not colonialism per se that causes resistance, but it's that post-colonial experience of betrayal when they leave countries like India, Pakistan, Algeria, then move to Britain and Europe in the hope that they will be given respect and recognition, a bit like, how these Afghan interpreters are now being treated by British government, not being given asylum and refuge after the British troops moved away from Afghanistan. And it is that more recent memory of betrayal, of racism, that I think is stoking resistance. There is deep, deep anger. I mean, Windrush is just one example. There's so much more. I mean, people have forgotten that when South Asian women, immigrants, were coming into Great Britain in the 1960s and 70s, they were being tested for their virginity. So, these things are not written about, but there are layers and layers of betrayals and resultant anger that is now playing out in this COVID context.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, there was a question. I think Sareen was saying, do you think this historical history of ethical abuses in clinical research against ethnic minority has had an effect on vaccine uptake?
Yeah, and very recent history, very, very recent history. I mean, there have been abuses in Africa. There have been clinical trials in Africa, not just Tuskegee. I mean, Tuskegee is horrific, and a lot of brown and black people identify with that horror against what happened in Tuskegee. But equally, there were trials in Nigeria where first pharma companies claimed that nothing had gone wrong. Then they lost in the courts and they paid huge sums of money. This news travels. I mean, if the government thinks that brown and black people do not think, cannot think, should not think, then we have a problem. Human beings think. If white thinking is allowed, then surely brown and black thinking should also be allowed. And if that thinking happens, at some point there has to be an interaction where the people who are interacting from the government side have to have some idea of the context of the people who they're trying to communicate with, because just barking orders in English will not do.
Mm-hmm. Touching on that note of interaction, as you just mentioned, Natasha Chowdhury, a colleague from Health, says, thank you very much for the presentation. I do not have any question, but really just wanted to thank you for sharing such a crucial perspective on vaccines. Very important. I wish that community engagement and participatory research have been more dominant in this current campaign to gain a real understanding of why there is resistance. Yeah.
I agree.
This is what I think that your case illustrates that through the Indian eradication of smallpox, insisting on that they were the forces in the ground. I mean, the public health officials or health workers that were trained in the ground, those that made this possible, and all the pains they needed to, and the barriers they need to overcome to be within those communities, isn't it? I mean, we're forgetting about that human factor, as you say, that is needed.
Yeah.
And so, Serene, sorry.
Yeah. So, one cannot generalize about any organization, WHO or Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, but when I have spoken to people, the people who are remembered on the ground, whether they're British, they're American, they're French, it doesn't matter what nationality, international workers, the ones who are remembered are the ones who made an effort to engage communities at a social level with cultural respect. They're the ones who remember. The people who now claim to have been great heroes in the smallpox eradication program, with very little evidence in the archives to suggest that this was the case, are the ones who rely more on artificial post eradication narratives that stem from the imaginations than any real contribution. But they're also usually the ones who never really engaged local workers. And what was very, very striking for me as I traveled across India interviewing people is how many people remember Donald Henderson, who spent a huge amount of time walking roads and villages and talking to people and engaging communities, and not some of the other self-professed or self-advertised leaders who hardly did that sort of travel. So that engagement is very, very important, whether you do it through a reliable interpreter or not. The capacity to have a meal, the capacity to go and sit through a religious ceremony in a local temple or a mosque respectfully, so that a community then trusts you, and then you can talk to that community either directly or through a interpreter. These things matter. It's not like Boris Johnson before one of these elections going into Gurdwara and talking with an Indian accent and saying, we can reduce duty-free duty on duty-free whiskey, so you can have cheaper clinky in a Gurdwara, in a Sikh temple, where it had to be pointed out to him by a very brave lady that many Sikh do not drink, and this is not a place to say such things. So, it's again, knowledge about context and willingness to learn about context is very, very important.
Mm-hmm. Sanjoy, Sareen says, another comment or question says, why do you think we have seen a proliferation of false bad information about COVID? For example, the conspiracy theories or the 5G microchips.
So I would say that it's been a result of a weakness of communication on behalf of the pro-vaccinators. And I'm a pro-vaccination person myself, and I think people supportive of vaccination have been quite terrible about communicating lack of scientific certainty and yet confidence in vaccinations. And here it's not just the neoliberals who are responsible, but also a liberal elite, a left-leaning liberal elite, which often looks down at people it talks to. So, if after Brexit we haven't learned our lessons about the dangers of not communicating, not trying to understand what the views are on the ground, and then paying for it, I think this is another problem where I think there have been really, really bad communication decisions, which, just because some global actors control vast, territory in the UK media, and therefore, I often joke that some of these media reports, you can put them in Turnitin and they'll come out as plagiarism because they're all saying the same thing, because they're being funded or supported by global actors to say the same thing. As advertising revenues dry up for many newspapers, including The Guardian, there seem to be more and more reliance on some of these liberal global actors. And therefore, what happens is I think there is increasing popular suspicion of media sources for as a source of independent, balanced reporting, and therefore that space that is then created because of the suspicion then allows for this sort of nonsense about 5Gs and microchips. I myself am deeply suspicious of the Gates Foundation and its activities, but I don't think that by getting vaccinated, as I will be day after tomorrow, that my body will have a microchip which will allow Bill Gates to know whatever I'm thinking. So, but this needs to be countered thoughtfully, humanely, and with knowledge of context, I think, and that's not happening.
No, it's true. Okay, I'm not sure if there are any other questions or comments. Simonetta?
Yes, I have a question because something has been puzzling me for a while. I'm trying to find out why is it that the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Oxford, why is it having so many, as we say, resistance in the British government's country with the people, and it is their own. I'm just trying to find out, why, if it's your own, why are you rejecting it? Is it, as you say, is the media? I'm just so confused because the Caribbean is also getting the AstraZeneca, which this one is from India, I was told, but I'm just trying to find out why, why all this vaccine hesitant for your own vaccine.
So, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the research was done in Oxford, and initially from leaked papers, it's clear that Oxford was going to create a vaccine for the world and allow companies all over the world to produce the vaccine free of cost, at cost, and deliver at cost all over the world, right? So, but again, whistleblowers have told us since then that the Gates Foundation, which supported some of this research, then insisted that Oxford not create a license-free vaccine, but it have a license agreement with AstraZeneca, which would then sell the vaccine. So for me, that was the first kiss of death in terms of hesitancy, because I'm of Indian origin. I'm very, very aware that many thoughtful people in society, in academia, in administration are deeply suspicious of the sort of things the Gates Foundation supports and what its aims are. So the moment the AstraZeneca vaccine was linked to Gates funding, that created a basic basis, a very significant, but a basis for resistance. However, one of the impacts of globalization and the fact that right from the 1980s and Margaret Thatcher, my dog has just walked in case you hear her barking, she's just arrived. Manufacturing capacity in Great Britain was destroyed. So once upon a time, Britain had a very strong vaccine production capacity. But globalization has meant that the science can be done in Britain, but that science to be translated into actual vaccine production means that it has to be an international collaboration. So the AstraZeneca vaccine is based on Oxford or UK science, but produced internationally and also funded internationally. A huge amount of public funding, taxpayers' funding, went into the AstraZeneca vaccine. So it's an international vaccine. It's the vaccine I'll be getting day after tomorrow, and I'm going to take it with confidence. Whether it's produced in Great Britain, in Wrexham, whether it's produced in Belgium, or whether it's produced in India, it's the same vaccine. It's the same technology. And I know that the Caribbean has been getting a lot of bilateral assistance from India through the Vaccine Maitri campaign, where, yes, indeed, India has provided hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of doses free of cost to countries in the Caribbean and across Asia and Africa. So I think, the opposition again stems from the lack of transparency about how this research was funded, why the Gates Foundation wanted licensing, why the Gates Foundation will not support free production of this vaccine by all producers in the world, available producers in the world. So, for me, any resistance that does exist against this vaccine is primarily based on the Gates link, but also because of some very unsavory politics that we've been seeing from the European Union, sadly, in relation to the AstraZeneca vaccine. So it's a combination, always a combination. Nothing is black and white in public health. It's always black and white and lots of grays. And so there are lots of grays here. But I personally am delighted to receive the AstraZeneca vaccine day after tomorrow.
Okay, thank you, Sanjoy. Thank you very much for the insightful talk. I think that really excellent seminar. Thank you for all the contributors and the discussion.
Thank you.
And yes, I think that I don't want to cut anyone, but thank you so much, Sanjoy, for your time and excellent talk. I agree with all the comments here in the chat box. I'm going to stop before I forget.